No mai haere mai, and welcome to this very special episode of the Maxim Institute podcast. My name is Jason, and on today's episode, honouring those who have served our country, Executive Director Tim Wilson talks to Dr Rowan Light about his recently released book, Anzac Nations, The Legacy of Gallipoli in New Zealand and Australia, from 1965 to 2015. On this podcast, Rowan examines the myth-making around Anzac and how commemoration has evolved over the years. He reflects on his own experience of Anzac growing up and of being at the Anzac Centenary in 2015. He then offers some thoughts on how we might see changes to the celebration of Anzac Day in the future. We hope that you enjoy this very special episode honouring the sacrifice of those who have served our nation.
Kia ora, Rowan. Great to be with you and talk with you. Anzac Nations, The Legacy of Gallipoli in New Zealand and Australia, 1965-2015. It's a book about Anzac. It's a significant and weighty but also fascinating tome. Why did you write it?
So I suppose the book springs from a couple of really key questions that were quite personal for me, and I suppose which are really about why do societies remember and commemorate certain parts of their past, certain aspects of their past, and why do those and share stories about the past, and why are these so important and sort of vital for cultures. And so what I do in the book is explore those big questions in relation to Anzac, and I suppose asking, well, why has Anzac become our why does it hold such a prominent place in our national calendar? How has it changed, and what does that tell us about this question of this deep sort of need that societies have for the past? In 2015 we marked the centenary of the Gallipoli landing, and we invested as a society a lot of money, a lot of emotion in this moment. The interesting thing is that as I start off in the book, is that 50 years ago, public attitudes to Anzac were quite different, markedly different. For many public leaders, politicians, and community leaders, the expectation around Anzac Day was that it would not necessarily continue to exist beyond the needs of the returned servicemen who had served at places like Gallipoli in the First World War.
So when the last serviceman who had been at Gallipoli passed away, we would all forget about Anzac Day, and that would be just another episode in history. Is that what the thinking was in 1965?
Yeah, there was certainly many, that was an expectation, and certainly I think they would not have imagined that Anzac Day might have been could be transformed into this national commemoration that we think of it today in terms of the sort of sense of public ownership that we have over Anzac, and the sense that the sort of expectations that we have of Anzac Day now. If we think about the place of Gallipoli, and the pilgrimage to Gallipoli that young people, as well as other Australians and New Zealanders, sort of undertake.
Yeah, no, you've hit on something there, which is the young people have been increasingly, I think, drawn into the Anzac narrative that is being presented. Is that fair? And if so, why do you think that is?
It's so the shift in sort of public ownership and the kind of focus of Anzac commemoration as one in which we, the New Zealand public, are not simply participants, become almost the object of the commemoration, in that we are called to remember. We are sort of it is our attention and our sort of sense of our participation is what is required. The powerful sort of moral command, lest we forget, do not forget, you remember.
We shall remember them.
We shall remember is directed at us in a way, and potentially, particularly to young people, as the kind of those who will kind of carry the torch. That's a big difference to how Anzac Day was celebrated or commemorated in its first 50 years, where it was much more of a focus on an image of citizenship through military service, and the image of that we see in our monuments, our First World War monuments, are of the citizen soldier, the soldier who went to war, who paid the dues of citizenship and returns triumphant. That, I think, in the last 50 years has changed in ways that depict those Anzacs who fought at Gallipoli as less akin to kind of military warriors triumphing over enemies, and much more as victims, as sacrificial lambs, maybe, who then are like us. That we, even the way we depict the Anzacs is much more of sort of fresh-faced youths, rather than men necessarily who made perhaps conscious decisions to go to war for different reasons. Now, where do we see that's changed is something like film. So something I explore in the book is the way that film representations change in the 1980s. And that's an interesting...
Can you give me an example?
Yeah.
One film in particular. Is there a moment in a film that encapsulates the kind of reimagining of Anzac soldiers as that you've described? Yeah,
so the classic Anzac film, the modern Anzac film is Gallipoli, produced by and directed by Peter Weir. And Weir's Gallipoli kind of exemplifies this shift, and really in an important kind of cultural moment recreates the Anzacs, not just for Australians. It's called the Australian film, but it also shaped New Zealand audiences in really interesting ways.
Is there a scene that encapsulates that reconfiguration that you're describing in your book?
Yes, well, it's really more the tone of the film.
Okay.
But there are certainly some very powerful scenes.
Give me a scene.
The most powerful scene is the last scene. It's the climax of the film. It's the scene that you knew was coming, which is the death of Archie Hamilton, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Anzac, who really embodies this reconfiguration, as you say, of Anzac as an embodiment of nationhood, as an embodiment of us. And in this moment, he's riddled with machine gun fire from in a hopeless attack on the Turkish line. We are meant to see ourselves and the nation as a victim, as ultimately a victim of the British Empire. So that's really there's some sort of setup of this scene, which is that of British incompetence, of military incompetence.
Yeah, British incompetence, British indifference, and us as passive executors of another will.
Yeah, and so when if we take that as a scene in a film in the 1980s is telling a very particular story, and this goes back to this question of, well, why do societies tell certain stories? Why do they retell certain stories? The fact that this film is very appealing in the 1980s tells us a lot about how New Zealand and Australian society is changing as a consequence of what are huge cultural shifts with the end of the British Empire. So something I set up at the start of the book is really that story, which was really a story we're still very much part of, even in 2022, which is the way that the British Empire had defined New Zealand culture in many ways, and the end of that slow end of the British Empire produced some profound crises, which were political, economic, but also cultural, and therefore needed new stories, new scripts to kind of provide to make sense of that experience. And Anzac is one that I think has been kind of fixed on.
I want to talk just personally about your interest in remembrance and the way that societies make meaning out of events. Why are you, Rowan Light, so interested in this? Does it go back to any experience you had as a young boy growing up? Did you have an experience of Anzac Day that was particularly memorable?
In some ways, Anzac was actually I think it was part of the texture of my childhood, and like it would be for many New Zealanders, just part of the kind of fabric of the sort of rhythm of growing up. In that, for example, you might have, I had a great-grandfather who served at Gallipoli in the Somme, so we had family medals that came out at Anzac Day, and that's for school marches. We would, if you were old enough, you got to wear them. And I went to a Catholic school, so that was woven into the rhythms of remembering the dead as Catholics. So there were some very natural ways that it fit into our lives. But it was really quite peripheral in many ways. And strangely enough, quite peripheral to actually how I got to this project. And really what brought me to Anzac was actually much more an experience of realising, as I studied New Zealand history at university, was that there are multiple histories that we have in New Zealand. And this is something that, as we've talked about, is so alive today. We've just had the new history curriculum introduced into schools, and the whole emphasis on that is trying to bring out this idea that there have been histories which we've downplayed or that we haven't had part of our public knowledge, such as, the New Zealand Wars, for example. And so the idea of bringing these back into kind of a public focus. And I remember studying and sort of appreciating that much more as a university student.
So it crystallised at university as you were studying history.
Yeah, and what it sent me on was a bit of a spiralling kind of personal quest, a crisis, a sort of an intellectual crisis of actually, well, what does it mean to remember certain aspects of our past, and what does that need? What does that need tell us? And also, how do we, moving forward, how do we sort of decide, well, which aspects of our past do we highlight?
And that is something that we will get to, as well as what is the future of Anzac Day. We will get there. I'm interested as well in hearing a bit about the research that you went through to write the book. Did you go to Gallipoli? What was that experience like? How does it end up on the pages? The
awesome things about doing a topic like this, which has that amazing kind of public cachet, and because it's about shifts in public participation in Anzac, is that everyone has a story, everyone has an opinion about Anzac and the changes in Anzac. And so I talked to people of certain generations, and they'd say, "Oh yeah, we've seen this change. And in some ways, it's probably the first time they'd actually stopped and thought about it and gone, oh yeah, you're right. Actually, we didn't attend Anzac Day like we do now, or if we did, it was with a very different tone. We never expected the Prime Minister to deliver a speech on Anzac Day. Now that would have been
unthinkable.
Yeah, well,
in
literally
1965.
I mean, literally, Helen Clark becomes the first New Zealand Prime Minister to attend the dawn service at Gallipoli in 2005. So that's not that long ago. So we're talking about some really recent shifts. So in 1990, as a sort of part of the book, which compares the Australian commemoration at Gallipoli, which is the first time the Australian Prime Minister Bob Hawke attends the dawn service at Gallipoli, a very important kind of political moment in which the tides of Anzac are shifting, and the political appeal and political rhetoric of Anzac starts to shift. The New Zealand Prime Minister is not attending. The Governor General attends, Paul Reeves, and that's because it's seen as much more the appropriate role of a Governor General to play the part of kind of high priest in a way in this sacred moment. Now I think that's blurred, and we actually expect our prime ministers to take on much more of a sort of a role, as one of an Australian historian put it, the interpreter of the nation. So we expect the prime minister to give a speech which is rhetorical and speaks to our heart.
For many, taking part in a local dawn parade or Anzac Day service is an important tradition that spans generations. Part of our heritage, it acknowledges and honours those who served our country and sacrificed their all. Things are different this year.
It's meaningful,
Yes.
conveys the emotions that we are experiencing, possibly, about this particular commemoration. That's fascinating because it suggests that our notion of what leadership is also changing. So the changes in narrative around Anzac Day are responses to our changes in understanding what our political system might or might not deliver to us on some very, very differentiated levels. So it's not purely about politics anymore. It's about, that quote-unquote high priest role.
Yes, and that's a shift that I identified quite strongly in the book, which is that our commemoration of Gallipoli is much more defined by the state in a way that it was defined by a broader kind of civil society in 1965. And I think that tells us a lot about the changes in our society and how in many ways, the kind of blurring of different sources of kind of authority that we've had in our society, where many of which have sort of fallen away or kind of have big question marks over. And so the state in some ways becomes more and more fundamental to defining the relationships between citizens.
As, if I can complete the thought, I don't know if I'm correct, but as civil society erodes?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen huge shifts in civil society since the 1960s. And part of that is going back to that other thread that I was drawing out, was were changing global contexts. So the fact that the British Empire had been such an important kind of cultural sort of glue for understanding citizenship in Aotearoa and in Australia. So, for example, in that period from the 1970s, 1980s, we see the introduction of national currency, so the move away from a pound, a shared British currency. We have our passports. We have New Zealand passports being introduced. These came out of necessity because an old British world, where membership of a British world had kind of defined
who we were
and how we travelled in the world, they're no longer working.
Well, we're decoupling from them.
Yeah, they're starting to deteriorate.
I want to I do want to talk about the future of Anzac Day. We'll do that next, but I'm really curious about your personal experience of Gallipoli and what changed in your understanding of it, being there at commemorations, being in that geography, engaging with it. What was that like?
Gallipoli is interesting because it's over there. It has that kind of distance. One of the highlights of doing the research for this book was going to Gallipoli for the 2015 centenary. So there was the lottery. So there were 10,000 Australian, New Zealand citizens with the prime ministers and official dignitaries of various countries.
Did you win the lottery?
Well, I had a friend actually. So I was the plus one friend who knew I was doing this research and said, well, you've got to come. So I had this really incredible experience. If you catch the bus from Istanbul and head south, you come to the Dardanelles. And the Dardanelles is it's a place with lots of layers of mythology. It's the long thought place of Troy. It's a landscape.
The long thought location of Troy.
Yeah,
Okay.
Yes. So if we think about Homer's Troy and the kind of deep roots of mythology in this place. But anyway,
That launched 1,000 ships.
Exactly. And but you go there, and it was a long journey because of all the security. There were a lot of security concerns. So there were lots of stops and lots of standing in lines and getting your pass checked, which was really interesting because it basically meant you got to have lots of conversations with all sorts of people. So Australians and New Zealanders, from some who were expats living in London and in Geneva, people who'd come from Tokoroa and Timaru, and brought with them invariably the family medals
Yeah.
that they were bringing back in a way, or that they saw as a kind of a very personal kind of family pilgrimage that they were connecting with.
Their personal tikanga.
Yeah, they were connecting to loved ones who had whether, and this is the interesting thing, many didn't necessarily have a direct ancestor kind of soldier who fought at Gallipoli. Maybe they were Second World War veterans, maybe they fought on the Western Front, but Gallipoli was a framework in which they could have those stories recognised, which tells it again is a powerful shift that we've seen in Anzac. So we've seen this kind of interesting story where Anzac has become broader. It's been able to encompass nationhood. It's become in our national experiences, but it's also become narrower in the sense that we now kind of hold as synonyms really Anzac and Gallipoli and the First World War, and that was exemplified, I think, in the Te Papa Gallipoli exhibition, which was running over the centenary period and still running. It's running till now 2025, which tells us a lot about the success and the appeal of that exhibition. I don't know if you went to it, Tim, but it's called Gallipoli: The Scale of Our War. So the in a sense the entirety of our war experience
is compacted into Gallipoli.
Yes, and the fact that it did that in a way that was sufficient, or seemed they pulled it off, and it's been hugely successful, tells us a little bit about there's something here which goes beyond.
Okay, so you've blueprinted how that's happened between 1965 2015. What does the future of Anzac look like as you understand it? I know this is speculative. We don't know the future, but given what you've learned, what do you expect?
Yes, well, historians, we are creatures of the past. We try to inhabit the past. We're not the best at making predictions for the future. One thing that I think readers will get from the book is how often people have miscalled the future of Anzac, which is quite fun in a way, because it shows you how...
Well, it's great fun as a historian, because you get to say, well, look how silly they were.
That's right.
I would never make such an egregious error, but I'm going to ask you to do it on this podcast. Shortly I'll make all sorts of silly predictions for future historians to laugh at. I think that shows the contingency in a way, the contingency of our circumstances, that we have to make decisions about how things arise in front of us, and so I think I think a lot about how the disruption in Anzac. So one thing that we've seen, we had this crescendo of commemoration in 2015. Huge, unprecedented public financial investment in this commemoration. After that, a complete sort of dive of interest in Gallipoli. So in terms of the numbers who went to Gallipoli itself, there was a kind of fatigue, I think, a public fatigue, in the sense, okay, we've had this big moment, and now we'll kind of move on. So that decline is really interesting, because I think it tells us about how these kind of commemorative anniversaries take on a sort of super importance. And that's something that is explored in the book, whether it's the 75th anniversary of Gallipoli or the 90th and then the 100th. So we've seen this interesting kind of drop off. We've also had the disruption through COVID. So we had in the last 2 years, Anzac Day essentially cancelled as a public event. So there's questions as to what will happen now as we open back up, as people how will this have affected Anzac? The other interesting shift I think we'll see is so the first chapter in the book explores how the kind of crisis of Anzac Day in the 1960s is the decline and death of the First World War generation. And that's really what produces the first crisis in meaning, because these are the old men who had given they embodied what Anzac Day was about. So when they die or retire from public life, you have to come up with a new meaning. What the hell does it mean?
Yeah, you have to find a new meaning, or you put it on the shelf and say, well, that was that. We're seeing something a little bit similar with the Second World War generation now. So I think families are now we're having the death of the last of the Second World War generation. So the question, I think, is will we see a greater attention to the Second World War? I think what we'll probably see is that interest in the Second World War will spike as we hit some of the big anniversaries. So anniversaries create the kind of natural kind of reference points that governments can invest in, a commemoration around a certain event. There's interesting questions about why do governments see, what is the appeal, and why is there an assumption that a government would invest in kind of cultural infrastructure like that. I would suggest, as we've already talked about, that suggests a shift in the way the state kind of is expected to define our relationships now. And then the thing that we always have to ask, I think, is if commemoration and how we remember the past is about fulfilling the needs of the present, then that's what will always help us answer that question. What's the future of Anzac? It'll depend on the needs of the present and our needs, and we'll see how those pan out.
And what you're saying is we need to seize this opportunity to determine what the future of Anzac looks like, in the sense of we discuss what our needs are, at least have a conversation about it, and that will shape what Anzac looks like in 20 years.
I think that's absolutely part of it, and I want readers to walk away from this book having read it, that and saying, okay, these are stories, these are practices that make claims on myself as a New Zealand citizen, as an Australian citizen. I should be more reflective and actually on who's making these claims and why. But equally, if I want to have a stake in one way or the other, then I have to, particularly in this post-COVID world, as we look to get back together with each other off Zoom and into each other's lives in an embodied way, and back into each other's faces, that we see practices like Anzac as opportunities to do that, to make claims. What is the future? How do we want it? What do we want it to look like? Whether you love it or hate it, you've got to, if you put yourself out there, stake a claim.
Rowan Light, thank you very much.
They shall not grow old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.